The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclecs Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, Southbound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org. Welcome once again to the Charlotte Podcast Festival, the very first Charlotte Podcast Festival. In case we haven't met, my name is Joni Deutsch. I am the podcast lead for WFAE Charlotte's NPR news source. I'm also the host of WFAE's award-winning Amplifier podcast, where we highlight and explore the Charlotte music scene, including the artist, the musician that is coming up to speak to you today. Of course, this next hour, I will also be your moderator for the Charlotte Podcast Festival. For those who may not know, this festival is historic. You are part of an historic event. This is the first podcast festival for the city of Charlotte, the state of North Carolina, and to be honest, for the world, as it's a free month of full podcast sessions where anyone, everywhere, anywhere can attend. So we're so happy to have you here. To date, we've had more than 11,000 registrations to the Charlotte Podcast Festival from around the world. The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by WFAE, the Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, and Eclecs Creative Agency. Now, this hour's session is titled Beyond the Theme Song, How Music Makes the Podcast Mood. This session is for podcasters and audio storytellers who want to learn more about how to incorporate and weave together music in and out of their episodes and productions. What kind of music should you use, and when, and where, and how do you find it? That is this session today. Luckily, our accomplished Charlotte-based speaker is going to share his insight and how he's been able to do that for a number of award-winning chart-topping productions and podcasts. So let's go ahead and get him on the screen and we'll introduce him to everyone. This is Chad Lawson. Welcome, of course, to Chad Lawson. He, if you don't know him, now you will, is a chart-topping classical musician and Steinway artist. His major label piano album, You Finally Knew, was recorded at the famed Abbey Road Studios, Beatles, and was released this past spring on Decca Records, which is the home of Idina Menzel and Andrea Bocelli. You may have heard Chad's work in a number of television shows and movies, including The Vampire Diaries and The Walking Dead, and he is the composer for the chart-topping, award-winning podcast and Amazon television series, Lore, and its podcast cousin, if you will, Unobscured, both hosted by Aaron Mahnke. And of course, I should mention Chad, in his own right, is a podcast host of the musically minded and meditative podcast, Calm It Down. I've said a lot about him. Now he can speak for himself. Let's all give a warm welcome to Chad Lawson. Hi, Chad.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Joni. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for being here, Chad. And of course, I should mention to the audience, we are going to have a great conversation this hour. We look forward to answering your questions about music and podcast. We're going to ask that your audio remains muted. So make sure that you're still muted as we go about the session. But we want to hear from you in the Zoom chat box. So go ahead if you can and go ahead and put any questions that you have for Chad, any questions about music in the Zoom chat box as you remain muted for this hour. A reminder that this session is being recorded. It will be made available at the end of the month, so check your emails, including your spam, junk, promotions folders for that. And of course, we encourage you to check out the full list of sessions for the Charlotte Podcast Festival. We have 2 weeks left at charlottepodcastfestival.com. And if you're on social, you can use hashtag CLT Podcast Fest. Chad, I've talked long enough. We have a lot to talk about in the next 54 minutes. So I think a question that a lot of musicians, a lot of podcasters have about this topic is, what is the purpose for placing music into podcast? What does it add to the production? Is it even needed?
Well, and that last bit right there, that's exactly it. So I kind of have I try to keep everything super simple in everything that I do. So I have a why, who, and where. So let's go ahead and break those down. So the very first one being why. Why do you want music? Do you need it? Is it even necessary? You know, if your podcast is storytelling, then it's going to draw the listener in. It's going to bring people in. It's going to say, oh, you know what, this is almost like a movie in a roundabout way, except we don't have the visual. Now, if you're maybe educational, or maybe it's something, like a conversationalist where you have two or multiple people. At that point, and this is just my opinion, to be honest, and just what I have studied and just kind of researched and done personally on my own, not only as a musician, but also as a podcaster, is when it has conversationalists, it kind of gets in the way, right? And so like a lot of people have this idea of like, oh, I have to have music. Why? Well, to jazz it up, let's just have some fun and let's really bring people in. And a lot of times less is more, right? And so I think that's the biggest thing of the why, of looking at what your brand is, what your identity is, and saying, do I need it, right? I mean, we'll get into some music examples in just a little bit, being with some of the stuff that I'm working on. But I think for me personally, I think I would just really say, what is the brand of what I'm trying to create? Why? Case in point, we'll go ahead and jump to this really quick. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So one of the podcasts that I do music for is a podcast called Lore with Aaron Mahnke. And it's a history of folklore, and it's storytelling. It actually is nonfiction. These are true stories. They're pretty messed up, to be honest, as far as like where folklore comes from, right? The history of folklore. And so the interesting thing about Lore is the intro. So there was a spin-off of Lore called Unobscured, which is a tremendous documentary kind of podcast. And so the very first season, we're now in our third season, but the very first season was about the Salem witch trials. So, which could be really heady, really dark, and also very almost unapproachable because of the context of it. And so musically speaking, I wanted to take a different approach. And Aaron, when we had these conversations, it really was about, I wanted to take the view of take this in the right way, the witches that were going through this, right? So it wasn't like, here's a story about these people that were really horrible. I wanted to turn it around and make it the other way, because this is what I've learned with film scoring and with creating music for podcasts is the composer's job, or the music in your podcast or what have you, it's meant to tell the story that the narrator is not doing. I'm going to say that one more time because it's really important, especially where film scoring is concerned. The role of music and film, I know we're not talking about film right now, but you'll see my point. As a composer for film and television, the role of music is to tell the story that the camera doesn't capture, right? And so it's the same thing if you're like a storytelling podcast. The role of the music is to tell the story that you're not going to state with your narration. So that being said, that was my mindset with Unobscured Season 1 with the Salem Witch Trials. That being said, so we have this song here. If you're wearing headphones, I hope you are, because it sounds really cool, as I worked a long time on getting this sounding right. This is the intro for Unobscured Season 1. Okay, give me 1 second. There's a reason why I have to do this.
Actually, while Chad does that, a reminder to the audience that welcome again to the Charlotte Podcast Festival. Chad Lawson is our speaker today. He is the composer for the award-winning chart-topping podcast Lore. He's sharing really literally his production and music and podcasting. If you have any questions for him, feel free to put them in the comments below in the Zoom chat room. And also a reminder that today's session is being recorded and it will be made available at the end of the month, at the end of the festival.
Cool. Okay, exactly, just what she said. So if we look at this, so right there, just that little bit, just right here in the beginning, it's almost subtly bringing you in. And so we have this kind of quiet, kind of inviting tone. And then what you'll notice is, this is bugging me to death. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So the conversation is going on through this whole section. And Aaron is telling you a little bit about what's going on. And then once we kind of go further here, this section is basically where he was saying, you could join me for this podcast, right? So there's a reasoning why, I'm going to get out of here really quick. There's a reason and how the structure of the intro is done. So you have something really simple that's bringing you in, and then you have like this little bit of a mountain during the intro, and then you have a little bit of a fading out. And then we did that with lore and with unobscured, and what we're trying to do is just build this invitation almost. But the interesting thing about music, and this is why it's so important as to hit the why, is if the listener notices it, if the listener is just like, oh, that's really a great piece, oh, I totally missed what he was saying, then as a composer or as bringing in music for your podcast, it's almost a disservice. The role of a composer for film is, if the person notices the music, then the composer hasn't done their job, because it's meant to be intertwined, and it's meant to be a bedding, it's meant to be a support. It's not meant to be a spotlight. But the biggest difference between film and podcasting is we're missing one element, which is the visual, right? So we have to be even more aware. We have to be even more cognizant of what's going on musically speaking, because if you don't have that visionary, if everything is just completely audio, you have the potential to distract, right? Now, let's say you're not a storyteller. Let's say you're building something that's either educational or conversational. There's a really tremendous podcast. I wrote it down because it's so good. Good Night Stories for Rebel Girls. I don't know if anyone has ever checked this out or not. But they're incredibly creative how their music is placed out. And it's accents here. It's situated. And so it's just like a blend of sound effects and of music, and it's really tremendous. I really hope that you guys check it out. I'm going to say it one more time: Good Night Stories for Rebel Girls. Okay, it's really great. But some great examples of what you're wanting to create as a brand, as a sound, would be This American Life, right? Serial, lore. And so all of these things, like as soon as your audience hears that very first note, you want them to know, oh, cool, I love this podcast. This is great. Because the idea of like maybe using a different song with their different intros, you're never going to have that connection of just saying, oh yeah, I know what this is. This is really familiar. You know, people love familiarity. People love the knowing what to expect in some degree. So that being said, let me show you guys something really quick. You guys doing all right? Everyone enjoying this? Everybody having a good time? So for instance, I'm going to show you a song. I'm going to share my screen here. Dun, dun, dun. Cool. All right, so for instance, great, you can see it. This is okay. Why am I sharing this with you? Because this is actually the theme song for this thing that I do called Calm It Down. And the thing about Calm It Down is it's a podcast that I've created And reason being is because as a composer, as a musician, especially this year, I've had so many people reach out and say, you are holding my hand through the most anxious time of my life right now, right? Like my music is very common, it's very chilled, it's very soothing. It's meant to kind of like decompress. And there's almost not a day that goes by where I'm not hearing from someone. I'm just saying, your music is really helping me through this most anxious time in my life right now. And since I can't tour right now, since planes aren't in the air, I decided to create a podcast. And in doing so, it's been very educational because now I'm on the other side of it as a podcaster than I am as a composer. And what is so... When I create music for lore and obscured or anything else like that, I have to be really careful of not getting in the way, like I mentioned earlier. And so when you're bringing music into your podcast, you have to be careful not to get in the way. I can't stress that enough. But it never really clicked until I was on the other side of this as a podcaster. And so I'm going to share the screen again. I'm going to walk you through just a little bit of what I mean by this. Because if you'll notice, cool. Okay, great. Thanks, guys, for the patience. So much to juggle. Okay, so if you notice, if we have... When I was around 7 years old, my parents gave me a snow globe. Not just any snow globe, mind you, but a Charlie Brown snow globe. Okay, so that is the intro of Calm It Down, right? So I have just a few second clips of the music, and then all of a sudden the music is coming in. Now, that being said, once we go further, here's what I found that was so interesting. If I go down further in this episode, okay, so the premise behind Calm It Down is, can you guys see me? Cool. The premise behind Calm It Down is it's half story and then it's half meditation, like guided visuals and just techniques to really just help you calm down and just decompress. So obviously the music is meant to be super chill, like incredibly chill. So if in the middle of this meditation, let's just take a deep breath. Nothing intense. We're not competing for anything. Just, do you hear how calming it is? You hear how out of the way that music is, to where it's like it's a bed. And the interesting thing is, when in the early days when I was writing for lore with Unobscured or whatever, or with lore, I would create these beautiful strings, and I would create like these lush sounds and like all of this like musically creative stuff. And Aaron was like, it's not working. It's too much, you know? And I was like, what do you mean? Come on, this is great. This music sounds, it's lovely. It's like it webs and flows. And he goes, I can't talk over it. And that's when I was like, oh, okay. And it wasn't until I started building my own podcast with Calm It Down that I would bring in songs that would have strings or that have a guitar. And I was like, wow, this is really distracting, right? But you don't really realize it until you start bringing this in. Now, all right, so we've kind of gone over like why. Why do you want to have music? Do you need it, right? So just really, really kind of think about that. Now, let's say, okay, let's go ahead and say you want some music in. Let's say that you want an intro and an outro. Like every podcast should have, I won't say every, an intro and outro, like something that is identifiable. Remember, it's the whole brand, but we don't have a visual, so we have to think about it as how many aspects can we bring the listener in and make them be like, oh yeah, I recognize X, Y, Z. So, as I said earlier, why, who, where? So why do you need music? Who are you? And then where? Where are you going to get it from? This is really important because I don't want you to get sued, because I don't know you, but I'm an empath by nature, and so I like you, even though we've never spoken. And I would hate for you to get sued. So let's bypass that. A couple of quick things. I know next week that you guys are going to be covering the legal aspects,
Oh,
which
two
is
weeks.
awesome. Oh,
Yes.
in 2 weeks. I apologize. I'm in a time warp, as all of us are right now in 2020. Um, down the road. But really quickly, and I bring this up for a reason. Years ago, there's a great app called Mention, Mention, and you can put in any search query in there you want to, and it'll notify you whenever that query has been, something comes up. So this notification came up that some guy was using my music for a podcast. This is probably like maybe 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. And I was just like, what the heck, man? What is this all about? And so I did a little bit of research, and it turned out to be Aaron Mahnke of Lore. And he was actually going to be doing a live show up in like Vermont or something like that. And he was going to be playing the music while reading the show. I had no idea he was using the music. And so I was like, I reached out and I was like, oh man, this is actually kind of cool. I like this idea. I said, why don't I come up and I'll play for the live show while you're doing your reading? And he goes, oh, that's so great. I really appreciate that. He says, the room is like the size of a twin mattress. It's super small. So, let's keep in touch. But for the most part, I really appreciate you, connecting with me, and we just built a relationship. So we built a relationship, and then that's really how things began to grow with Lore, with my working with Aaron, and then eventually went on to do a television series with Amazon. But I bring this up for a reason. I love Aaron. He's actually one of my best friends. And so what you hope that he is as a person, he really is, which is why I love him. But the interesting thing is I asked him, I said, where did you find this music? And he goes, oh, SoundCloud. Okay. And you have to be careful with this, because to be truthful, and no slight to him, I didn't have the correct settings on there in SoundCloud. But with Creative Commons music, you have to be very, very, very careful, because you have to make sure, one, that it is Creative Commons if you're going to use it, and then two, you need to go ahead and take the extra step and reach out to that person. Because let's say you grab it while it's Creative Commons, and then all of a sudden that person sells that song to a catalog to then be licensed. So in a roundabout way, during this, you've brought it in, you've made this your brand, you've made this your identity now, to where your audience is like, oh yeah, there's that song, there's that podcast, I love it. And all of a sudden he's like, I need some quick cash, I'm going to sell this to a licensing catalog. Now they own it, and then they're going to come after you and they're going to say, why are you using our song? Well, it's Creative Commons. No, it's not. It's in our licensing catalog. And so then they'll ask, do you have documentation of permission that you can use this? No, it's Creative Commons. And so like you have to cover every track. So even if it is Creative Commons, reach out to the person. Reach out to the composer, reach out to the company. There's a litany of places where you can download this kind of stuff. And I'll be really quick, and it looks like you're raising your hand. Because the last thing that you need to be in a position is rebranding or being sued. So Jenny, you look like you had a question there.
Yeah, actually, I was going to just bring up, we're receiving, we had a question in the comments about where to find legally sounding music so that you don't get sued. So happy to share that we do have a session coming up at the end of the month during the Charlotte Podcast Festival that is all about how to not get sued for your podcast. That includes, how to be able to use music that is royalty-free, copyright-free, how to use trademarks. Also, as Chad's going to share in just a bit, how to be able to have a contract in place with someone like Chad if you are wanting to have original compositions made. So that's on October 27th. I'd highly recommend going in the chat box, and I put the link down there to register for it at the end of the month. With that said, Chad, I just want to mention that Creative Commons, for those who may not be familiar, it's basically a blanket license for anyone to be able to use, whether you're a big institution like a media outlet or an independent creator, for you to be able to utilize the music or the creative output placed. So again, Creative Commons, that's what Chad's referring to, is just basically, here you go, world, I'm putting out my information and you can use it based off the qualifications I put in. Sometimes Creative Commons will say you need to credit the artist in your piece of work. So you need to put a little liner note in your podcast or on your website saying that you're using their work. If you are wanting royalty-free, copyright-free music for your podcast, whether it's for your theme music or intros, outros, transitions, sound effects, I'm just going to recommend a couple websites for you to look into. Free Music Archive is a very, very popular one. That is freemusicarchive.org. Another one to look into is Ben Sound. That's Ben as in the name Ben, B-E-N, Sound, SOUND.com. Again, those are two. But if you are going to look into more options, the key phrases here, royalty-free, copyright-free. Now, Chad, with that said,
Yep.
You are an original composer. I mean, you
Yep.
create original compositions.
Yep.
So for those that are wanting something totally original, they're not going to hear it on any other podcast anywhere else in the world.
Yep.
What are some considerations for getting in touch with someone like you and having original compositions made?
Yeah, I love that you brought this up, and there's one or two in the chats that I want to hit with that really quick as well. So the list that you just mentioned, as far as like being able to find free music, I'll do it over time really quick. This is just a list from a website that I had found, and it has like 6 or 7 of free common places. Now that being said, let's think about this really quick. If you go and download something from a Creative Commons, from a website where that does offer free music, there's a couple of things that I would look at. I would avoid the most popular section. I would avoid anything that has an excessive amount of downloads, because it's free, but you're also going to sound like somebody else. So the last thing that you want to do is have a podcast about emotional wellness, and then all of a sudden you're listening to a podcast and you hear the same song and something that's like almost offensive, and just like, whoa, that's okay. So keep in mind that the music that you're going to use, if you're using this stuff from free, you're not the only one using it. So if you, and I get it, everybody has like a budget where they have to start with, and that's awesome. And if that is the case, and if you need to go there, cool, just dig around a little bit. Go to the like clearance bin, go to the very bottom, find the areas that people aren't using. But I really recommend that kind of stuff, the Creative Commons stuff, for your bedding if you want it throughout the podcast. Now, as far as an intro and outro, I would highly, every town, we're in Charlotte, there's so much talent here, so much talent, it's ridiculous. And so instead of going to the bargain bin and having an intro and outro of something that everybody else is using, find local talent. Find a singer-songwriter right here in town. Find a composer. And you know what? If you're on a shoestring budget, guess what? Artists, we love people. We just love creating. And so like if you are on a shoestring budget and you approach this guy that plays guitar, right? And let's say, hey, you know, I just need 30 seconds. Well, what's your budget? I can buy you a meal, maybe some beers, or I can feature you on this podcast. I can maybe take, you know, one very specific podcast and talk about your music. Or I just make sure that I highlight you in the very front, in the very beginning of who you are. So, Joni, what you got?
Yeah, I was going to add too that we may have a lot of people here that are interested in using music. And maybe one of the first things you want to use in your podcast is a song by a very popular artist. And it could be Chad, like when I say popular artist, it could be Chad, who's, you know, obviously has award-winning work on his own, or it could be like Bruno Mars or Justin Timberlake or Ariana Grande, whomever it is out there. I know your instinct is to want to make that music into your podcast, to use it because it's perfect. The lyrics are perfect. The sound is perfect. You love it. But my recommendation, and I would bet Chad's recommendation, is also going to be this. If you do not have the rights to that song, don't use it. Even if it's for just a few seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. One of the biggest, something? Oh, of course, yeah.
So my new album is on Decca, but Decca is under the whole umbrella of Universal Music, the largest record label in the world. I've actually, every Sunday night, I have a series called The Evening Calm, where I'm just playing some music on Sunday night. It's on Facebook, whatever. And what's so interesting is I pre-record it, usually on Wednesday, and then I schedule it, and it goes live, quote unquote, on Sunday. There have been so many times that I've recorded, scheduled, and it gets pulled down. And this is live. I'm not actually playing the song from the album directly. I'm actually playing it. I'm changing some of the melodies. I'm changing some of the speed, the tempo, and what have you. Dude, those algorithms are sick. They're
They
ridiculous. So if
absolutely
you think
are.
if you think you can put in like 4 or 5 seconds, they will pull it down, and then you'll get a letter from an attorney. This is serious stuff. I wish it weren't this way, honestly, because like I wouldn't be in the position that I am of podcast music if I hadn't been okay with letting people use my music for free. I'm really big with being like, okay, tell me a little bit about it. What's your budget? Are you shoestring? I'm trying to help you out. And if I really believe in what you're doing, then we'll figure something out, like back in the early days. But you just have these mammoth organizations. Now, if you want to make sure that you're avoiding this process, I would find someone like a group called musicbed, musicbed.com. So they actually are the go-between between artists and you. So my music's on MusicBed. I know 20,000 Hertz. I know Dallas and 20,000 Hertz. I think he uses MusicBed exclusively for the
It's a
music.
great music podcast.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. Hey Dallas, if you're listening. But he goes directly to MusicBed because he doesn't have to worry about it, right? So he's like, here's the song I want. What's it for? It's for a podcast. Cool. Here's the paperwork. You're good to go. You're cleared. So once that, let's say it's a major artist. That is, MusicBed has a number of artists that are on major labels. And let's say that you license from MusicBed or whoever, and then that gets put up somewhere, YouTube or podcasting or whatever. And so when Universal or whatever label hears that, they're going to say, do we have the proper paperwork? They're actually able to go and look at some schematics and they say, this is actually properly licensed. So you're good to go. It's called whitelisted. And so that way there's no trouble. I get that we want to have, Adele in the background, but, there's other ways of doing it. And I keep going back to finding local talent, finding someone in your own backyard where you're building this community for two reasons. It's also you're bringing them into the picture, you're giving them an audience, but their audience is now going to listen to you. So, and that's the interesting thing about lore, right? Like lore's audience is a demographic that I never would have hit. My music pretty much never would have found that audience on their own. Now, that being said, just keep an open mindedness about this. I'm just like realizing that one hand can wash the other with all of this.
And I would just, again, remind the audience that one of the biggest questions I receive as podcast manager and as someone who works in public radio is there a 30-second rule? Can I use a piece of music for 30 seconds and I'm fine? That is a rumor.
Yep.
It's not founded.
Okay.
And you could easily get sued or have a cease and desist letter sent to you, whether you use just a few seconds, 31 seconds, 29 seconds, whatever the case may be. So again, be safe. Don't be sorry. And if you are wanting more resources, because Chad and myself are not lawyers, we can't be your attorneys. We're not giving exact legal advice. We're only giving what we've experienced and seen in our lines of work. We do have that session coming up at the end of the month. You can register for it on how to be legally sound at charlottepodcastfestival.com. And Chad, I would also say to the audience, definitely get in touch with your local musicians and see if there's some way to barter or pay them for their time in creating original compositions for your podcast. Yep. You can find local independent musicians a few different ways. If you want to search on Bandcamp, bandcamp.com, that's bandcamp.com. Find your region, find your country, find your city, your state, look into that tag at bandcamp.com, and you'll see a full list of all kinds of artists and all kinds of genres, whether it's more classical instrumentalist or maybe rock or pop or rap or R&B. So Chad, I do want to bring up something because in my line of work, having helped produce podcasts, we have been in touch with original composers like yourself to create not just theme music and outro music, but also transitional music.
Yep.
So we have a couple questions here from individuals in the audience of
Yeah.
if they are getting in touch with an independent musician, original composer, what should be mentioned, what should be brought up when figuring out what pieces of music, what audio should be shared and bought?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I was seeing Christina's message as well, asking about that same question. So it's perfect. It can be as simple as the two of you writing down on a piece of paper of saying, okay, so and so has permission to use this person's song. This person is giving permission for them. And then if it is shoestring or if it's in the very beginning, perhaps you guys say, you know what, for right now, it's $50, right? $150, or just a number that you guys can agree on. And then let's say that you put into the agreement, if the podcast begins to become monetized, and then maybe a certain percentage would go to the composer up to, and you could do it two ways. You could leave it no cap, or you could cap it. Let's say, up until, I'm just throwing a number out there, $100,000. Let's say the podcast makes $100,000. At that point, you can look at the composer and be like, okay, $100,000, 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever, $100,000, you're good to go. And you have that writing, you get it notarized, right? And put everything down on paper. And the words of Prince, unless you're a genius, write it down, right? And because unfortunately, even though you're friends, stuff's going to get sticky every now and then. And as long as you have that piece of paper, and it's actually scientifically proven that when you write down something, your rational side of your brain actually takes over instead of your emotional side of your brain. And whenever there's a fight between two people legally, it's emotional, right? And so as long as you have no, this is what we signed, then that comes back to the rationality of it all. So I know it may seem to be weird. You're like, I'm doing a podcast. I'm looking at my backyard right now. I'm doing a podcast on how to mow better lawns. So, we don't need a contract for that. It's just, some acoustic guitar or something like that. We don't need a contract. It's fine. Well, let's say Home and Garden all of a sudden gets interested. And they're like, this is the best podcast we've ever heard about mowing yards, and we want to buy it. And you're like, okay, cool. That's awesome. And then let's say money is exchanged. And now the composer's like, what the heck? What just happened, right? And so you safeguard yourself, because if it does get bought out, that's the hope. Right? Let's say you're building this podcast and you're really hoping that one day you're going to monetize, make a living doing this, and where you're seeing so many podcast production companies being purchased, cover it just from the very beginning, and then you don't have to worry about it, right? So finding a local musician, calling them up and saying, hey, I need a song, and they're going to be like, hey, I write songs. I love this idea. Let's have some fun. Okay, what kind of agreement do you need? Money is not a 4-letter word. I want to say that one more time. Money is not a 4-letter word. I know some people don't like talking about it, but unfortunately, I like food. I have a feeling you like food. We all like food. I have a roof over my head. I'm wearing stuff. We need money, right? And so those services that we do shouldn't be a bad word. It's just a matter of coming up with an agreement of saying, okay, cool, I can work with this, or I can't financially, right? Okay, I think I don't want to beat that horse.
No. I think it's important just to note that, again, a service is a service, whether it's in the arts or in science or anything else. So if you're really wanting it, then it has value, and it should be valued. Just like any podcaster in your time, you should value your time. If this is a passion project you do for fun, you don't care about time, that's fine. That is your right to determine that. But make sure you respect others. And I'm sure our audience here, you understand that completely. Chad, a question here from Paulina, which ties in exactly to what you're just sharing. What specifically, how do you write a specification for a theme song to a musician? Yeah. How do you lay that out of what you're needing? And do you even know how, you're going to use that language to request it?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Where do I start with this? Whenever I'm working with a filmmaker, a producer, a director, what have you, the one thing I always is, if you can summarize down into one word, what's this about? And I'm like, no, no, no. Let me tell you the story. Let me tell you what it's all about. One word. And so, what is that one word your podcast is about? Because what happens is like if you over give, if you over, and everyone's different. This is how I work. If you're like, okay, this is what it's about, and then we talk about this, and 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 just like, and I think we're actually going to bring this in maybe after a couple of months and bring this in, and you're just like, whoa, simplicity. What is this about? And so, what you need to be very clear on what your brand is, what your podcast is about. And I understand that references aren't always going to work, especially if you're talking, if you personally aren't a music person. My wife can barely play a radio, right? I mean, she knows how to say, well, I don't want to say Alexa right now because it'll come on. But I mean, like, she's really good at that. But those things behind me, she hasn't a clue about. So I understand that, like, if you're in a position where you don't know anything musically and you're trying to get your vision across to someone that does, that it's difficult. I understand that. That being said, sometimes references get lost in the mix. And so using words like simple or loud or animated or aggressive, right? Because, like, let's say your podcast is about like the most amazing person in the world, right? And so then you're like, you know, the music needs to be like just like Tony Stark, Iron Man, AC/DC kind of stuff, you know? And so just something in the sense of where you can kind of almost paraphrase it. Now, let's say you take this, and I've seen this happen quite a bit actually, where you take this, you hire a group to do this, and nothing's working out. You just get to the point where, like, you're not getting it, and then that person's not getting it, and you're just like at this impasse where nothing is going to happen. At that point, I think that's where we go back to the piece of paper of what you have agreed upon, and inside that piece of paper saying, you know what, after 3 revisions, if we haven't landed on something, then we'll amicably say, it's not working out really well together. That's really important. But even with Music Bed and the work that I do, if it's what's the word I'm looking for? Custom score. There's only 2 revisions, and that's it. Unless they actually want to hire and pay more to do additional revisions. Because here's, unfortunately, from the musician side of point of view, you can be doing revisions forever, right? Oh, this is really great. This one part right here for these 3 seconds, can we just do something a little different right there? You know, it's just like, so put that clearly into writing of how many revisions, that if you guys are not able to get to a definitive, oh, this sounds great, then no troubles. You may want to pay them a little bit for doing their work and say, hey, I really appreciate it as a gratis. But then, and also allowing them to take that music and repurpose it. Because if you're not going to use it, they've obviously spent time into it, right, in creating things. Like, there's things that, like, I've written music for that never got placed, but I still own that material. Whereas the client doesn't get to keep that music because he didn't want it, so he didn't pay for it. And so I think as long as you have in a documentation notarized or written up by an attorney, which I highly recommend. Crap, where was I? I mean, just basically stating these are the details, and with custom music, that if you don't land on something after 2 or 3 times, then there's more than one musician in your backyard.
Yeah.
Define the scope of the work up front.
I think Christina's kind of basically sharing what you're saying, that before you go into an agreement with someone, before you say, like, I want work from you, you know, carte blanche, you should probably have something in writing. So make sure it's pre-production, right? Everyone, podcasting, you want to have a plan in place before you hit record, so that way you know where you're going. Likewise for reaching out to a musician or establishing a relationship, a working relationship with someone who's going to help you on your podcast. One thing I would just add to what Chad is sharing, there was a podcast I worked on at WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source here in Charlotte, and it's called She Says. And the podcast is a true crime investigative podcast. As you can imagine, lots of different sound effects or theme music. When we worked with an original local musician for original compositions in Charlotte, part of the agreement wasn't just receiving the fully mixed theme song, outro song, previously on song, coming up song, it was also the stems. So Chad can probably speak to this a little bit more, but what I would just say is that when you're talking with these original musicians, independent musicians, not only get the full composition that they make for you, but also request that you get these stems. And when I say stem, what I'm referring to, STEM, what I'm referring to is the independent tracks or the independent instruments that come together to create that fully formed piece of music. And I say that because you can use those stems in different ways in your production. In our case, we were able to layer, let's say the theme music included drums, piano, bass, guitar. We could use those individual instruments and layer them or mix them or do other things with them in transitional ways throughout the podcast because the agreement allowed us to have the stems plus the mixed version of the theme. So I would just encourage you that that's a conversation you can have with the musicians, that when you're, creating this document that's signed and notarized, you also request not just the music, but the stems. Chad, any other thoughts about stems? Maybe ways that you've used them or helped or make them?
Yeah, I'm actually opening a session right now. I'm
Beautiful.
so glad you brought this up.
And folks, keep asking your questions in the comments.
Yeah,
We're going to
please.
be here until 1, and I'm going to try to get through as many questions with Brad as possible.
Okay. It's all right. Okay, cool. All right, so I've got a session pulled up. I'm going to share my screen with you. Stems are very important because stems, let me just show you. Let me share the screen. Okay, this is actually in a piece for one of the upcoming episodes of I'm Scared. Are you guys in there? Cool, gotcha. All right, so when I'm writing a piece, everything you see right here, these are the individual parts. So I'm going to play you a little bit. Let's just see what it sounds like. Now notice that the volume is low right now. The mood is low. And in the story, this is not an intro, this is underbedding. This is about what's going to happen next. This is for Unobscured Season 3. And for those that aren't familiar, it's a documentary kind of musical. Sorry, I'm focused on too many things. It's a documentary about Jack the Ripper and the historical events that happened. So, okay, this is actually a really cool part. Let me show you what's going on over here. So with these stems, you guys can, okay, cool, awesome, you can see this. All right, so this section right here in particular, okay, let's say the reason why stems are so important, I actually am writing the music without knowing what the episode is. Right, so the episode has not been produced, and that's that way with Lore, it's that way with Unobscured, it's that way with just some various other ones. A lot of times these deadlines are so tight and they're so rushed that I actually don't hear the episodes until after they're produced. So I'm writing music kind of with my own imagination with this. So, which is fun. I actually prefer it that way. I ask them for that one word that I mentioned, and then I write whatever that one word is to musically. Now, purpose of stems. So this section right here, if I were to highlight, let's say this section. The reason why stems are so important, if I don't know how long a certain section needs to be, what they do, what iHeartMedia does for this podcast, is they can take this section and say, you know what, that's really awesome. I'm going to loop just that. Because this whole section, you've got some
If I could,
drums there.
I would nod my head off to that, Chad. That is, I do that all the time with stems.
Totally.
All the time.
So like that right there. Or I mean, you could have a whole conversation underneath that right there. Jack the Ripper, yada, 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 went out to go get some lunch. I don't know. So, like, stems are super important. Did I kind of answer?
Yeah, I think that was great. And that's one thing about having an original composition is that you can pretty much guarantee that you can have those stems added. Whereas if you do go to one of those free music websites, royalty free, copyright free, remember those key terms, it may not come with stems. So it may be harder for you to replicate that sound or duplicate it. As Chad just showed you, when in times you're like, oh, I need like 10 more seconds and be absolutely perfect. So Chad, we have about 7 minutes left together. We're going to go through a few last minute questions, and feel free, anyone in the audience, feel free to add your questions in. And a reminder that today's session is being recorded. It will be made available at the end of the month. Keep an eye on your emails, including your spam, junk, and promotions folders for it. Okay, so final questions for Chad. Chad,
really quick on the stems.
Of course.
Have that in your document.
Yes, absolutely. Have it in your contract.
That if, you know, when you're working with a musician to receive stems, and it may be extra, because I have to be honest, stems are a pain in the butt. Because let me show you, and I don't want to belabor this, but I just want to show you why stems should cost extra. Let's say some of these pieces, let's see, for instance, this guy is, you know, he's just over 4 minutes long. So with the stem, what I have to do is I have to solo every single instrument, and I have to wait for that to go all the way through. And then you guys, are you seeing the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then I have to go here. And I have to wait for every instrument. So like it's so incredibly time involved as far as stems are. So keep in mind that if you're asking for stems, there is going to be an upcharge more than likely, just so you know. Okay.
So Chad, last few questions. We've talked a lot about original compositions. We've shared a bit about how to find music online that's not, from a composer like yourself. Just to sum it up, what are some basic considerations you'd share with our audience today about how to incorporate whatever music it is into their podcast productions?
Can you put that in a box for me?
So basically, like if someone were to come to you saying, I have a piece of music, but I'm a little worried about where to use it or how to use it, what are just some basic considerations that you'd give to them?
Yeah, basically, I would say, does it add to the project? I mean, like, in all simplicity. And I have to do this, like, as a composer, am I adding it to add something, or is it actually making a difference? And that's the biggest thing you need to ask yourself. Not only musically, but even in your copy, right? Even in your storytelling. It's like, does this really matter? And before I was able to be a musician full time, I actually used to be a video editor. And that was the greatest job that I didn't really like. That was the greatest thing ever, because I learned the other side of it. I learned how to tell a story and realize, you know what, this is what I personally would like to put in there, but it's not meant for the audience. It's not meant for the end project. Who is your demo? Who is your audience? And that is the biggest thing you need to figure out before you even hit record on your very first episode. Who is your audience? Because that's going to affect everything. That's going to affect your music. It's going to affect your tone of voice. It's going to affect your tone of voice. It's going to affect everything that you do. Yeah. And so realizing that and saying, hey, you know what? Calm it down. I've done so much. I'm an analytics junkie. I'm a nerd. My biggest audience for Calm It Down is females ages 20 to 40. They're into yoga. They're into wellness, they're into meditation. So I'm not going to put, Drake style music and calm it down. I'm going to put something that's going to go. So if you're wanting to bring music in, don't bring it in because you like the song. Don't bring it in because it's your favorite. Bring it in because it makes sense, it matters, and it's going to connect with the subject matter of what you're talking about.
Now, I would say yes, and target audience is perfect. It's something I mentioned at a question earlier in the session. If you have questions about whether the original composition or the music you're putting into the podcast works, then why not bring it to someone that you'd consider your target audience? Ask them, maybe point blank, what are your thoughts on this? When you hear this music, what does it make you think of? Does it make you think of the podcast that I'm actually producing that's in this genre? Chad, what were you going to say?
Sarah V had an awesome question.
Yeah.
Yes. Is it better to have tracks with fewer instruments? Yes. Oh, God, how are we running out of time? Two important things. Your mind can only listen to one thing at a time. So if you have music that has no reverb, that's very dry, that listener's brain is not going to know what to listen to. They're either going to try to listen to the music or they're going to try to listen to the voice, to your narration. Find music that has reverb, that feels a little bit more distant than right here, because that's the role of the VO. Now, if you can't find music in that regard, if it is like piano music, no reverb, what I do with Calm It Down, I actually pan the voice and the music. Not much, maybe like 5 to the left, 5 to the right. So the voice is over here, and then the music is over here. And that helps so much with your brain. Right? Like I was listening to a podcast yesterday with two people talking and they were both right here. Why? Make sure that your podcast is not in mono. There's a lot of famous ones out there that are in mono and it drives me nuts. So make sure you're in stereo. And if you're having a conversationally dialogue podcast, pan them out. It's super easy. Put one over here, put one over here. That way, it's almost like a conversation. Right? And so with music, and Sarah, thank you so much for bringing this question up. Simplicity is better. Whenever you listen to lore, that's why it's almost always solo piano, because nothing gets in the way.
Zavona, you had a great question about taking popular sound bites and using them over original music. I would say that may get into a territory of it could get into a territory of fair use, which is a legal term about what could be used. And if you're transforming another piece of work in a new way, I will say again, I'm not a lawyer, but I would recommend that you do attend our session at the end of the month that goes more in depth about fair use and how you can transform pieces of work, including sound bites or other compositions, remixes, if you will. Chad, do you have other thoughts about that comment or that question?
Yeah, just, at the end of the day, is it worth it? Is it really worth getting into trouble? Really?
Yeah.
Is it worth it?
So Chad, again, we're wrapping up. I guess the last question I'll have for you is one I don't think we really mentioned. When thinking about music for a podcast, whether it is the theme music or transitional music, stems, if you will, when should the podcaster think about incorporating music? Should they think about the kind of music they want as they're writing the episodes, as they're recording them, after they've mixed everything but the music?
Everyone is different. Everyone has a personal take. I think because I used to be a video editor, what I would do first is I would actually put the story together first. Just because your story is the most important thing, right? Is it cohesive? Is your copy cohesive? And then what you'll find is when you begin adding music, then you can say, oh, actually, I know how this is going to flow. And so if your story has let's say chapters in it, then you have those transitions. You know that this part of the section, this part of your story, your copy is maybe heavy, and then the next one right here is inspirational, and then this section is, so if you write out a piece of paper and this top section is this style, this style, this style, then you can go back and say, okay, I'm looking for something inspirational. And because otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to just be pulling random music that you really don't have a place for it yet. So I would complete my copy, complete the story, and then I would sleep on it for a day. I'm really big into subconscious thinking. Your subconscious is always working behind the scenes. So if you create the storyline, the next day you go back to it and say, yeah, this works, or oh my gosh, what was I thinking? And then once you have a solid idea of what the context is, then find the music, because you're going to find it's only going to elevate it because you're already starting with a strong support structure, right? If you're depending on music to carry your show, it's it, it's going to be just average, and we don't want average, right? We want like this to be the most amazing listening experience. You're changing people's lives. You realize that? Like what you're doing, that we're not just making podcasting. You are literally changing people's lives. The words that you hear, you will never meet these people. There are so many people I've never met in my entire life that write me that say, I had your music on while our baby was being born. But there are so many people that you'll never hear from. So when you're doing this, go all the way. Take every single step, do it right, because you're not doing it just because you're wanting to create a podcast. You're affecting people's lives. Sorry, that's just my soapbox.
Sorry that everyone's going to have an impact on everyone in the world. Sorry you all are going to be amazing podcasters if you aren't already. But speaking of that, let's give a warm welcome, thank you, a round of applause to Chad Lawson for being our amazing podcast speaker today and speaking to the subject of music and compositions and sound design. Of course, if you are wondering, Chad can be found on social media, and you can also go to his website to learn more about his work, both podcasting and non, which is chadlawson.com, and check out his podcast, brand new, Calm It Down.
Thanks.
Calm It Down.
Thank you, Jerry, so much.
Well, thank you, Chad. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you for staying with us. I know we're just a couple minutes after, but we had so many questions to go through. I'm so happy to say that this is not the last session we're doing during the Charlotte Podcast Festival. Oh, no, we are 2 more weeks left until the end of the month, 2 more weeks of sessions. Next week, it's all about marketing, branding, communications, and community building. And the 4th week is about longevity in podcasting, legal considerations, even monetization, how to make money off of this audio world. So we hope to see you. The registrations are free, but space is limited. Do not wait to save a seat. Go to charlottepodcastfestival.com. And we do have a happy hour coming up every Friday. So if you want to mix and mingle with other podcasters, we hope to see you at one of those Friday happy hours. Other little things to consider, feel free to share about us on social media. If you enjoyed today's session, let others know. You can hashtag it CLT Podcast Fest. And if you really want to support this session, if you want to support the podcasters and the free trainings that we're doing this entire month of October, I would encourage you to pick up one of these brand new locally designed in Charlotte t-shirts, CLT Podcast Fest. We'll get you on, Chad. And you can pick one up on our website, which is charlottepodcastfestival.com. It's the best way to keep these trainings free and accessible to you, your community, and the world. I've been your moderator, Joni Deutsch. Thank you all again for staying today with us. We really look forward to seeing you again next week or the week after. And until we meet again, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Friday, an awesome weekend, and keep on podcasting.